What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We've been looking at the college football playoff scenarios that could potentially come up as we close out the 2020 season. First of all, we looked at the teams that still control their own destiny, teams that if they win out, they are in the college football playoff. And then we looked at both Alabama and Notre Dame as potentially being locks as long as they don't lose in the regular season. Even if they lose in their conference championship games, they are pretty much locks to make it into the college football playoff. Alabama's more than Notre Dame, but I feel like both teams, unless there is a blowout in the conference championship game, both teams are going to be in regardless of whether or not they win or lose those conference games. So what we're doing here, we looked at, in that video, we looked at what happens if Alabama loses. We looked at what happens if Notre Dame loses. But what if they both lose? What if Alabama loses to Florida, Notre Dame loses to Clemson, which could happen. I know most people don't really expect Florida to beat Alabama, but it could definitely happen. Florida's a really good team, an explosive offense. That could absolutely happen, and it wouldn't be crazy to think about Florida beating Alabama. So what if it happens? What if Alabama does indeed lose to Florida and Notre Dame does indeed lose to Clemson? We're going to go through what I think will be one of two scenarios that the playoff committee will go with if that does happen. So if both Alabama and Notre Dame lose, and we're not talking about regular season, I think it's pretty clear they're going to win their regular season games. But if they lose in their conference championship games, this is what we will have. We will have a one-loss Alabama, an undefeated Cincinnati, a one-loss Clemson, a one-loss Florida, a one-loss Notre Dame, an undefeated Ohio State, and a one-loss Texas A&M. This is the group of teams. These 7 teams would be the teams that the committee would be considering. I think there's really no one else that would be in this discussion. And you notice here, I put the CC there as conference champions. Cincinnati, Clemson, Florida, Ohio State. Those would be the 4 conference champions out of this group of teams. To me, if I was doing it, those would be the 4 playoff teams. I do not believe you should make it into the college football playoff if you lose a conference championship game. Really, I don't think you should be in if you're not a conference champion. That's just my personal opinion, though. That's a topic for another day. To me, though, it makes the conference championship games that more important. It makes them like playoff games. So to me, it's an elimination game. You lose a conference championship game, you're out of it. But that is obviously not the way the committee is going to look at this. So these are the teams, again, that would be in consideration. I don't really think Cincinnati would have much of a chance. I don't think there would be much of a discussion. I think they're pretty clearly going to be at the bottom of this list. And I think Texas A&M probably not going to make it in. They were blown out by Alabama. I know they have the head-to-head over Florida, but I don't think A&M would be in. So what it really comes down to is Alabama, Clemson, Florida, Notre Dame, and Ohio State. And of course, with Ohio State, there's a big question about the rest of their season. How many games are they actually going to play? Are they going to get to play in the Big Ten championship game? I don't know if that's necessarily a big deal, because I think beating Wisconsin on that championship Saturday might be a better win than beating Northwestern. The only difference is you wouldn't be crowned the conference champion. And I think the committee would obviously look at that and say, well, they should have gone to that game. It was because of COVID, because of this crazy rule. You know, I think Ohio State would actually not hurt that much if that does indeed happen. But I don't know that they would get in, even if they go undefeated, and even if they get to play every game, and even if they win the Big Ten championship, just because of the way this thing could play out. So if that does happen, again, we're talking Clemson beating Notre Dame, and that's the scenario in this video, and we're talking Florida beating Alabama. If that happens, I think Clemson will be number 1. I think beating Notre Dame will be enough. They're already at 3, and with the top 2 teams losing, I think they go up to number 1. Would Florida potentially go all the way up to number 1? I don't think so. I think the committee is also looking at Clemson, and you would look at that loss, which their loss would be very similar to Florida's loss coming on the road in a close game. But the difference is Clemson didn't have their full roster, and Florida actually didn't either against Texas A&M, to be fair. They were missing some guys on defense, but Clemson was missing some key players on that side of the ball, and also they were missing their starting quarterback, Trevor Lawrence. That's obviously a big deal, and because of that and because of where the teams are ranked right now, I think Clemson would go to number 1. I do have Florida going to number 2, though. I think they would pass Alabama after beating them. They would pass Notre Dame after the Irish would have lost. They would pass Ohio State, and they would pass Texas A&M. Even though A&M would have the head-to-head, I think the Gators would go in front of them because they would have 2 top 10 wins. They would have a win over Georgia, also a win over Alabama. And don't forget, that Georgia win was very impressive. A&M would just have the 1 win over Florida. That's really all they would have when you look at those big-time wins. So I think Florida goes to number 2. Now the big question becomes, who gets the final 2 spots? And like I said, it's between Alabama, Notre Dame, and Ohio State. And in this scenario, we're saying that Ohio State gets to play all their games. I think that, you know, we're going to say they play Michigan State, they play Michigan, they go to the Big Ten Championship, they beat Northwestern. This is not a done deal as far as how this would go because we don't know exactly how the teams would play in their final games. Ohio State could be really impressive and start beating teams by 30 points. Or maybe they just barely squeak by. How do the losses happen in the conference championship games for Notre Dame and Alabama? A lot of different factors that would potentially make this go different directions. But I'm going to give you the 2 most likely scenarios that the College Football Playoff Committee, I think, will go with. All right, so this is my prediction. This is how I think it would go if it does indeed happen. I think Alabama winds up at number 3. And I know you're going to instantly say, they're not going to put teams in here and have a rematch. They're not going to do that. There's no way they put Alabama at number 3. The College Football Playoff Committee does not set these matchups. They set the New Year's, I've said this a lot of times, they set the New Year's Six Bowl matchups, but they do not set the playoff matchups. They simply rank the teams. 1 plays 4, 2 plays 3. Now, I understand sometimes they would alter a ranking if it's very close just to avoid a potential rematch. I don't think that would happen in this scenario, though, because I've actually got Notre Dame at number 4. This is how I think it would go, and there's really no way you can justify putting Notre Dame ahead of Alabama when Alabama was ahead going into the conference championship. I mean, there's just no way, really, to justify that unless they do want to switch those teams just because they want to see those. They don't want to see a rematch. But again, I've said this in several videos. I think Clemson Notre Dame would be a great rematch if they split the series because you get the best of 3 and you find out really who the better team is. So I think this is what they would go with. This is, again, it's going to be like this, or they switch Alabama Notre Dame, put Alabama at number 4, Notre Dame at number 3. I think this is how they will rank the teams in this scenario. Now, what happens if Alabama gets blown out by Florida or Notre Dame gets blown out by Clemson? And also, how does Ohio State look in their final games? I'll go ahead and tell you right now, Alabama is in. I don't care if they lose by 28. Alabama is in. And I think the committee is going to look at their whole body of work. They're going to look at how impressive they have been. And I don't really see any scenario that knocks Alabama out of the college football playoff. To me, it's just not going to happen. I mean, if they do get beat by a lot, which they're not going to, it's just not going to happen. But if they did, I don't think it would really matter that much. They're just probably going to look at it and say, well, they just had a bad game. It was just a little bit of a fluke. I'm just telling you, that's how the committee views Alabama, and we have seen that over the years. So Alabama, I think, will be in. If Notre Dame loses by a lot, if they lose by 20 points in this game, or if Ohio State is just really impressive down the stretch, if the Buckeyes are blowing everyone out, if they beat Michigan State and Michigan by 30, 40 points, if they beat Northwestern by 20, 30 points, I think there is also a scenario where the committee is going to look at this and they're going to say, well, Ohio State was really impressive down the stretch. They didn't get to play as many games, but that's not their fault. And they have already shown that they're just going to judge these teams based on the games that they have played. Notre Dame, on the other hand, yes, they have that one win over Clemson. And what happens if Miami beats North Carolina? Then North Carolina is a 4-loss team, so that's not a great win anymore. They would have the win over Clemson, but the committee could go this route and they could say, well, they only won that game because Trevor Lawrence wasn't there, or the players on defense were out for Clemson. Notre Dame really wasn't that good. And again, this is if they lose big to Clemson in the ACC championship. They pull Notre Dame out of the top 4. And if they go with that, and Ohio State's really impressive, I think they actually wind up putting Ohio State at number 3. And this would be a scenario where they might look at matchups. Ohio State goes to number 3, Alabama to number 4, and this would be your bracket. So I think it's going to be one of these two scenarios. Again, if Alabama and Notre Dame lose in their conference championship games, I think we see Alabama versus Clemson in the Sugar Bowl, and then we see Florida versus Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. It's very possible they go this route. It'll be one of these two. I would pretty much guarantee. I do not think Texas A&M or Cincinnati would have any real shot. I think it will be these 5 teams, Clemson and Florida definitely in. And so then it just really comes down to how they view Alabama, Ohio State, and Notre Dame. And like I said, a lot of that could depend on how the teams finish the season, how impressive they are. So it's hard to say. So I can't give you a definitive answer of how the rankings would look in this scenario, but I can tell you it'll be one of these two ways. This is, it's not going to be enough. That's not going to help A&M or Cincinnati. It'll be between Alabama, Ohio State, and Notre Dame for those final 2 spots. I personally think Ohio State will be on the outside looking in unless they're super impressive and Notre Dame gets beat by a lot. I just don't think Ohio State's going to have the resume, and it's maybe not their fault that they didn't play as many games, but I don't think the committee is going to care too much. I think they're going to go with the teams that have built the resume, and I think the Buckeyes would be on the outside looking in. I would love to know what you guys think. How do you think it would play out? What's your 1, 2, 3, and 4 if both Alabama and Notre Dame lose their conference championship games? Again, give me your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Up next, we're going to look at Cincinnati's path to the college football playoff as we continue to break down all the different scenarios that could potentially play out as we close out the season. Again, thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football channel.